There are things humans built before they built anything you can visit. Before the pyramids, before Stonehenge, before the earliest temples rising out of the Mesopotamian mud. There were 100,000 years of human life. Maybe more. Campfires burning in the dark. Children learning to nap flint by watching their mother's hands. Small groups of people moving across grasslands so wide they had no name for where one ended and another began. And almost none of it left a monument. Almost none of it left anything at all. That's the question that keeps archaeologists and geneticists and anthropologists awake at night. Not just what happened before civilization, but what filled all of that time. Because there was so much of it. Modern humans, people with brains like yours and mine, have been around for at least 300,000 years. Writing was invented maybe 5,500 years ago, which means that for something like 294,500 years, humans were fully human and completely invisible to the history books. Not because nothing was happening, because we haven't been looking in the right places, asking the right questions, or using the right tools to hear what the past is trying to tell us. Here's what we do have. Stones shaped into points and blades and scrapers by hands that knew exactly what they were doing. Bones split open for marrow and left in patterns that tell us something about how people hunted and shared food. Ash layers pressed into the walls of ancient caves, evidence of fires that burned night after night, season after season. Pigments, red ochre ground to powder, and pressed against stone surfaces in shapes that meant something to someone. DNA extracted from teeth and finger bones, carrying molecular memories of migrations and encounters and near extinctions, and footprints, actual footprints, pressed into ancient mud and hardened into rock, the literal stride of someone walking towards something 120,000 years ago. This is the evidence we're working with, and I want to be honest with you right from the start. The way any good guide should be when you're about to walk into uncertain territory. A lot of what we know about this period is probabilistic. Researchers look at the physical traces and build the most reasonable interpretation they can, knowing that the next fossil or the next cave site might shift the picture. Different regions of the world have different archaeological records, some dense and studied for over a century, others barely touched. So when scientists say something probably happened, or that a particular behaviour may have emerged in a certain period, those words are doing real work. They're not hedging. They're being honest about what the evidence allows. What we're doing tonight is taking that honest, uncertain, genuinely fascinating picture and sitting with it, not rushing toward the cities and the kings and the wars that usually fill the history books, but slowing down. Going back to the camps on the lake shores, to the caves where people painted animals they hunted and maybe animals they feared, to the grasslands where a group of maybe 30 people were everything each other had, to the coasts where people learned to read the tides and fish the shallows and eat shellfish and stare out at a horizon that had no name yet, to the ice at the edges of the livable world where humans pushed farther than any primate had any business going and survived anyway. That's the journey this script is going to take. Slowly, deliberately, the way you'd walk through a very old and very dark forest. There's no reason to run. Everything here rewards patience. And before we start, I want to know where you are right now. What city? What coast? What corner of the world are you listening from? And what time is it there? Because this is the thing I love about making these. Someone in Nairobi is listening while the sun comes up. Someone in Glasgow is falling asleep with the rain on the window. Someone in Auckland is already into tomorrow, and someone in Sao Paulo is exactly halfway through their night. We're spread across the same planet that those early humans first spread across, and something about that feels worth acknowledging. So drop it in the comments if you feel like it. Where you are, what time, maybe whether you came here to learn or to sleep, or both. Because, honestly, both is fine. That's why I make them this way. Now, let's go back. Not to the beginning of the universe, not even to the beginning of our species, just to the long human night before anyone thought to write anything down. So let's start with a definition, because the word civilization carries a lot of weight, and we should know exactly what we mean when we use it. When historians and archaeologists talk about civilization in the technical sense, they are pointing at a fairly specific cluster of things: cities, or at least large permanent settlements with dense populations; writing systems or some equivalent technology for storing information outside of human memory; states, meaning centralized political authority with the power to tax, conscript, and make decisions for large numbers of people. Usually you also see monumental architecture, professional specialization, and formal religious institutions. These are the markers. And the earliest examples we have of anything that checks most of those boxes appear around 5,500 to 6,000 years ago in Mesopotamia and Egypt, and somewhat independently in the Indus Valley and in China not long after. That's the starting line for civilization as most textbooks define it. But here's the thing about starting lines. They don't tell you when the runners left home, because the humans who built those first cities didn't emerge from nowhere. They were the descendants of people who had been doing enormously complex, culturally rich, cognitively demanding things for a very long time. Anatomically modern humans, people whose skeletons we would recognize immediately as our own kind, appear in the fossil record somewhere around 300,000 years ago in Africa. The oldest well-dated remains come from a site called Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, and behavioral evidence suggesting fully modern cognition, symbolic thinking, planning, and long-distance exchange starts showing up convincingly around 100,000 to 120,000 years ago, though some researchers push it earlier. So between those first flickers of behavioral modernity and the invention of writing, you have roughly 100,000 years of fully human life that has no written record and left no monuments standing above ground. That's the missing part. Not missing because it didn't happen. Missing because it didn't preserve the way stone temples do. Now, Homo sapiens weren't alone in this world, not for most of that period. When our ancestors were living in Africa, Eurasia was occupied by other humans, cognitively sophisticated, socially complex humans who had been there for hundreds of thousands of years. Neanderthals across Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans across Central and Eastern Asia, and into Southeast Asia, and at least one or two other archaic populations whose traces are still being sorted out from the genetic and fossil evidence. The world before 40,000 years ago was a world with multiple kinds of people in it, each with their own technologies, their own adaptations, their own ways of living. When modern humans finally spread out of Africa, they didn't walk into empty landscapes. They walked into someone else's story. So how do we know any of this? That's the question that matters almost as much as the facts themselves, because the way archaeologists reconstruct behavior from physical remains is genuinely remarkable and genuinely limited at the same time. What survives tends to be what's hard. Stone tools endure beautifully. Bone survives under the right conditions. Ash and charcoal can be dated with some precision. Ochre and other pigments cling to rock surfaces for tens of thousands of years. What disappears is almost everything else. Wooden tools, plant foods, woven materials, spoken language, music, social rules, kinship systems, beliefs, all of it organic or intangible, all of it gone. What we find is the durable residue of lives that were mostly made of things that don't last. And even what does survive is unevenly distributed. Caves are spectacular preservers because they're sheltered and stable, and archaeologists have been digging them for over a century. Open-air sites are harder to find, harder to read, and have often been disturbed by thousands of years of erosion, farming, or construction. Coastal sites from this period are almost entirely underwater now because sea levels were lower during the ice ages and have risen significantly since. That means we're probably missing a huge portion of the record from exactly the kinds of productive coastal environments where early humans likely concentrated in large numbers. What all of this means is that the story of pre-civilization humanity is not a simple story, and it's not a finished one. What researchers can say with confidence is that these were not simple people. Complex thought, social coordination, long-range planning, symbolic expression, all of it was happening. All of it was present. The absence of writing doesn't mean the absence of culture any more than the absence of photographs means a person had no face. And that's the core idea to hold on to as we move through everything that follows. Complexity doesn't require cities. Culture doesn't require texts. Meaning doesn't require monuments. The people we're talking about were fully, deeply, remarkably human. They just organised that humanity in ways we're only beginning to understand. The evidence is subtle, scattered and incomplete, and it's still more than enough to be astonishing. To understand what those missing 100,000 years felt like from the ground, you have to change the background picture in your mind. Not rolling green fields and warm summers like a postcard from the English countryside. Not endless Sahara dunes either. Think of a world whose basic setting keeps sliding back and forth, like a dimmer switch someone is always fiddling with. Glacial, interglacial, colder, warmer, back again. Over the last couple of million years, Earth has been cycling in and out of ice ages. Huge ice sheets grow over North America and Northern Europe, then shrink back. Temperatures drop by several degrees on average, then climb again. Sea levels fall, then rise, sometimes by more than 100 meters. These changes don't happen overnight. A full glacial interglacial swing takes tens of thousands of years. But inside those big swings, the climate can jerk around surprisingly fast. From the perspective of a human lifetime, you might notice winters getting a little harsher, summers a little shorter, game a little scarcer. From the perspective of a few generations, your grandchildren might be living in a landscape that your grandparents would barely recognize. For people without cities, without stored grain, without any guarantee about next year's rainfall, climate wasn't background. It was the main character. When ice built up at the poles and on northern continents, it locked away enormous amounts of water. Global sea level dropped, in some phases by over 100 meters. That single fact quietly redrew the map of the planet. Shallow seas turned into dry land. Wide coastal shelves became broad plains. Places that are now underwater, continental margins, river mouths, estuaries, would have been exposed and, in many cases, beautifully rich environments. Rivers would have been longer, their lower valleys stretched out across what is now seafloor. Fresh water, fish, shellfish, plant foods, driftwood, all concentrated where land met the lowered sea. It also meant land bridges appeared where today we see only water. Between Siberia and Alaska, a vast cold grassland, Beringia, connected Asia and North America. Between what is now Britain and mainland Europe, a low, marshy plain called Doggerland joined the two. Between islands in Southeast Asia, chains of stepping stone land meant you could walk or wade to places that now require boats. These weren't narrow little paths. During glacial low stands, some of these land bridges were hundreds of kilometers wide. Herds of animals crossed them. Predators followed. And behind the predators, humans. Then, thousands of years later, the ice retreated. Seas rose. Coastlines crept inland, drowning old campsites, old hunting routes, old stories tied to specific headlands and river mouths. A bay became a strait. A grassland became a shallow sea. What had once been your people's familiar territory could, over the course of a few generations, turn into a place no one could walk anymore. From our perspective, looking back, those drowned worlds are mostly invisible. The best camping spots, the most productive shorelines, the places where people probably gathered in the largest numbers for tens of thousands of years. Many of them are now under tens of meters of water. That's part of why the record looks so patchy. We're missing not just time, but geography. On land, something similar was happening with ice and climate. When glaciers grew, they didn't cover the whole planet. They draped themselves over high latitudes and high mountains. In between, vast regions stayed ice-free but colder, drier, more seasonal. Forests in some areas retreated, replaced by steppe and open woodland. In other places, deserts expanded, cutting off routes that had once been passable. But even in the coldest phases, there were pockets where life remained relatively good. Places where water still flowed, plants still grew, herds still passed through. Biologists and paleoclimatologists call these refugia, refuges. Refugia could be river valleys that kept running because they were fed by distant glaciers, springs bubbling up from aquifers untouched by surface drought, coastal zones where upwelling brought nutrients and fish close to shore, sheltered south-facing slopes that caught more sun and stayed just a bit warmer than the land around them. For humans, these places were resource magnets. Again and again in the archaeological record you see the same pattern. As climates worsen, populations retract into a smaller number of favourable zones. Groups that had been spread widely across a region cluster along major rivers, around lakes, near persistent springs, in coastal pockets where shellfish and seaweed and stranded whales could buffer them against bad years inland. When climates improve, people flow back out along those corridors, up the river valleys, across the reopened grasslands, onto newly exposed coasts. When climates worsen again, they pull back. Expansion, contraction, expansion, contraction. Breathing in and out with the ice. From the inside, that would have meant languages, customs, and technologies constantly mixing, separating, remixing as groups split off, met others, merged, or disappeared. A slight shift in rainfall could tilt the balance between one valley and another. A river that had always run in living memory might suddenly go dry for several seasons in a row. A marsh that had been a reliable source of reeds and birds might salt over as sea level rose. People would follow the water, or the animals that followed the water. Sometimes that might mean a whole band agreeing to move, elders and children included. Sometimes it might mean a few adventurous families quietly slipping away to try their luck in a new direction. Over centuries, those small decisions add up to what we, from a distance, call a migration pulse. We can actually see some of these pulses in the genetic data. Periods where lineages spread rapidly, suggesting population growth and movement into new ground. Periods where lineages seem to contract or fragment, suggesting bottlenecks and isolation. But long before genetics, the environment itself was recording these changes. Layers of mud at the bottom of lakes and oceans trap tiny fragments of past landscapes. Grains of pollen from plants raining down year after year. Shells of microscopic organisms that build their bodies with oxygen from the surrounding water. Dust blown from distant deserts. When scientists drill long, slender cores through these sediments, they pull up a timeline. Pollen types, stacked in sequence, tell you which plants were flourishing when. Pine and spruce in colder spells, oak and other broadleaf trees in warmer ones, grasses and sagebrush, when things were dry and open. The ratio of different oxygen isotopes in shells hints at global ice volume and temperature. Layers richer in dust mark windier, probably drier conditions. Layers rich in charcoal mark ancient fire regimes. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica hold even finer grain stories. Year by year, snow-trapped bubbles of air, traces of volcanic eruptions, subtle shifts in atmospheric gases. In those frozen cylinders you can see abrupt warming events, sharp steps lasting only a human lifetime or two, where temperatures jumped by several degrees. fast enough that a person born at the beginning might die in a climate noticeably different from the one they grew up in. Now line that up with human timelines. In a world where your survival depends on tracking animal migrations, knowing the season when a particular plant ripens, remembering where the last good spring was during the last bad drought, those swings were enormous pressures. When conditions worsened, groups that clung too rigidly to old habits would have suffered. Groups that experimented new foods, new tools, new alliances, new routes had a better chance. So environmental change didn't just move people around. It turned up the volume on innovation. Cold, open steppe favoured efficient, long-range hunting weapons and good clothing. Dense forests favoured close-range ambushes and tools for woodworking. Unstable rainfall pushed people towards strategies that spread risk, sharing food more widely within and between groups, building alliances, arranging marriages across distance so you had kin to turn to if your local resources failed. An unusually rich patch, say, a river bend where migrating fish stacked up, or a coastal lagoon heavy with shellfish, could anchor people seasonally, or even for most of the year. That kind of semi-sedentary life makes new things possible. Heavier tools, more elaborate shelters, more complex social rituals because you're seeing many of the same people year after year in the same place. Then a shift in sea level or rainfall might undercut that security, forcing people back into higher mobility. Techniques and customs that had evolved around relative stability would have to be trimmed down, made portable, adapted. From our distant vantage point, those reorganizations don't leave written chronicles. There's no inscription that says, "In the year when the river failed, we abandoned the lower camp and went toward the mountains." What we see instead are pattern changes, layers in a cave where the stone tools suddenly switch styles, bones of different animals appearing, indicating a new menu, charcoal spikes suggesting a phase of heavy burning, perhaps to clear vegetation or drive game, gaps in the record from one region, coinciding with new sites appearing somewhere else. Put the environmental cause and the archaeological layers side by side, and you start to glimpse the choreography. A cold snap here, followed by evidence of people clustering in refugia. A warm interval there, followed by a spread of new tool types over broad territories. Sea level dropping, followed by signs of expanding coastal use. Sea level rising, followed by inland sites growing in importance. The missing 100,000 years, in other words, didn't unfold on a stable stage. The stage itself was sliding, tilting, flooding, freezing, thawing. Ice advanced and retreated. Forests expanded and shrank. Coasts moved tens of kilometers back and forth. Humans responded not as passive victims, but as highly flexible strategists. Sometimes moving, sometimes digging in, sometimes reinventing their tools and their social rules to fit new landscapes. And it's on that shifting, restless planet that we have to picture everything else in this story: their families, their camps, their tools, their rituals. To see how they actually live day to day, we need to zoom in from the global ice and ocean picture to the scale of the small moving group. So now, with the world's climate clock ticking in the background, let's step into one of those bands and see how life without cities was organized from the inside. If you had walked into most human societies during those long tens of thousands of years, you wouldn't have found a village or a town or anything that felt like a tribe in the way we usually imagine it. You would have found a band, maybe 20 people, maybe 30 or 40 in a good season, a handful of elders, a cluster of adult men and women, a lot of children of different ages, a couple of teenagers trying very hard to act like adults, a few dogs in the later parts of the story. That was the basic unit of human life for an enormous stretch of time. But even 20 to 40 can mislead you if you picture a fixed membership, like a sports team with a stable roster. These bands were more like constantly shifting circles. People married out, cousins married in, visitors stayed for a season, and then drifted away with the next movement of animals or the next rumour of better land. Death took some. Birth added others. Anthropologists sometimes call this fission fusion dynamics. The band might split for a while when resources were thin, smaller foraging parties with fewer mouths to feed, covering more ground. Then, when conditions improved, you'd see the opposite. Bands coming together into larger gatherings, 50, 100, even a few hundred people camped along a river bend or a rich shoreline. Those aggregations weren't random swarms, they were reunions. Related bands that usually lived a few days' walk apart would plan to meet when a predictable resource peaked, a salmon run, a mass migration of hoofed animals, a seasonal fruiting of nuts or berries. People would arrive along well-known paths, greeted with recognition and old jokes. Marriages would be arranged, stories exchanged, disputes settled or quietly sidestepped. Tools, ornaments, raw materials would move from hand to hand. Then the abundance faded, and the big camp dissolved back into small moving nodes. From the outside, that all looks loose and fluid, no walls. No police, no courts, no written laws, but inside those bands and between them, there was an invisible scaffolding. Kinship, reciprocity, and shared rules. Kinship seems simple, who you're related to. But in small-scale societies, related can be much more flexible than just biological parents and siblings. People classify each other into categories: mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, even when the genetics are distant or mixed. Somebody who helped raise you might be mother, as much as the person who gave birth to you. A close friend of your father might be uncle, even if no one can quite remember the exact genealogical link. Those terms come with expectations. You owe respect to some categories, care to others, joking familiarity to others still. These expectations are a kind of unwritten law code, held in memory rather than on paper. They tell you who you can tease, who you can marry, who you can't even think about in that way. Overlaying that kinship web is reciprocity, the long, slow circulation of favours and obligations. In a band of 30 people, nobody survives purely by their own effort. You might be a skilled hunter but fall sick for a week. You might be nursing an infant and unable to spend long days ranging for food. You might simply have bad luck again and again, while someone else seems to have been kissed by the game spirits this season. The only way to make that tolerable is to spread risk. So when a large animal is killed, the meat is not quietly dragged away and cooked in private. It's portioned out. Different societies have different systems. Some share equally, some according to role, some according to household size, but the general pattern is wide distribution. Everyone knows who was responsible for the kill, but the glory is converted into generosity rather than hoarding. That kind of sharing isn't charity, it's insurance. You give when you have, partly because it feels right, partly because you know that in some future bad week, that flow will reverse. I carried your child when you were weak. You will help mine when I am old. Nobody needs to track every transaction in a notebook. Human memory, backed by constant conversation and gossip, is more than enough bookkeeping. Cooperation extended into child rearing as well. In small bands, children were not isolated in nuclear families, the way they often are in modern cities. A baby had a primary mother, but also a cluster of others, older siblings, grandmothers, aunts, sometimes unrelated women who held, fed, watched, soothed. Fathers took their turn, so did uncles, and even adolescents learning by doing. Biologists call this cooperative breeding. For humans, it seems to have been a built-in feature. Our infants are unusually helpless and demanding. 1 or 2 adults alone would struggle to meet those needs while also gathering food. A network of carers makes it possible. Around the fire in the evening, decisions were made much the same way. Should we move camp tomorrow? Is it worth trying for the herd we saw 2 days ago, or has it already passed beyond our usual range? Do we risk sending a small party across the mountains, or wait one more season? In many bands, these choices weren't handed down by a permanent chief. They were argued, mulled, revisited. Elders with long memories spoke, successful hunters spoke, midwives who knew which valleys had medicines and which had malaria-bearing mosquitoes spoke. Leadership was often situational. The best tracker might lead the hunt because everyone trusted his reading of the ground. A woman with deep knowledge of local plants might have the final say when it came to where to camp for access to water and food. A calm, respected elder might take charge when tension flared between families. When the situation changed, the leader changed with it. There were certainly bands, especially later in the Ice Age and in particularly rich environments, where more formal hierarchy seems to appear, people buried with more goods, evidence of special status. But for much of the long pre-civilizational stretch, status was probably more like a cloud around individuals than a crown on their heads. It could thicken or thin depending on recent behavior, generosity, and remembered reputation. None of this means life was a peaceful utopia. Humans are still humans. In small groups, conflicts are actually more dangerous in some ways, because you can't easily get away from the people you live with. There is no anonymous crowd to disappear into. If two men hate each other, or two women, or two families, that tension sits right there in the camp, day after day. We know from bones and from comparative studies of recent foraging peoples that interpersonal violence did happen. Fights over mates, over insults, over perceived unfairness in sharing. Homicide is not a modern invention, but there were strong pressures to keep things from spiralling. One common strategy was avoidance. If a feud became too bitter, one party might simply leave, joining relatives in another band, or forming a new offshoot group. In a world with low population density, space was a kind of safety valve. Another was mediation. Older, respected figures could step in, reminding people of obligations, proposing compensations, gifts, apologies, ritual gestures that allowed face to be saved. Among some recent hunter-gatherers, a song duel or a joking contest stands in for a fistfight. The audience's laughter decides the winner, and the matter is, in theory, laid to rest. Without prisons or standing armies, the harshest collective punishment available was expulsion or, in extreme cases, group-sanctioned killing of someone seen as an ongoing threat. Both would have been rare, but in small bands the mere possibility could be a strong deterrent. To be cut off from your kin network was to lose your safety net. As we talk about these patterns, band size, sharing, situational leadership, it's tempting to treat modern hunter-gatherer societies as perfect mirrors of the deep past. But they aren't. Groups like the San of southern Africa, the Hadza of Tanzania, indigenous foragers in Australia or the Arctic, all live or lived under the shadow of neighbouring farmers, herders and states. Their worlds have been shaped by contact, displacement, disease, and trade for centuries or millennia. Even so, careful ethnography does something invaluable. It shows that a human life can be organised in these small-scale, mobile, low-hierarchy ways and still be rich in meaning, full of rules, full of politics, full of arguments and reconciliations. It gives us plausible models for how bands might operate when there are no kings, no police, no written constitutions. And when we lay those models alongside the archaeological hints, small campsite sizes, patterns of seasonal movement, shared tool styles spreading across vast areas, it becomes easier to picture those long-ago evenings. Not as silent, grim struggles against the cold, but as dense social worlds. People teasing and flirting, negotiating and remembering, raising children together, keeping track of who owed what to whom, deciding where to go next. On that foundation of small bands and invisible institutions, everything else in the missing 100,000 years rested. the ways people got food, made tools, built shelters, and slowly, patiently transformed their relationship with the landscapes around them. So, with that band in mind, circled loosely around its fire, let's look more closely at how they actually stayed alive from day to day, how they found water, managed fire, and wove their lives around the slow, repeating rhythms of the camp. When you zoom in from the big evolutionary story to the scale of a single day, survival looks less like heroics and more like repetition. Wake, warm, walk, gather, share, sleep, repeat thousands of times with small variations and occasional crises. Start with food, because almost every decision the band makes, in the end, loops back to calories. For much of the deep past, hunting and gathering did not mean constant dramatic hunts with spears raised against mammoths. It meant what archaeologists sometimes call broad-spectrum foraging. Imagine a landscape, mentally divided into dozens of little categories. This valley, where a certain tuber grows if you dig in the right places. That ridgeline, where a tough, bitter seed can be roasted to become edible. A particular patch of coastal rocks where shellfish cling in predictable bands. A rotten log that means fat, slow grubs if you know how to split it. A termite mound that can be raided at dusk. An anthill that yields sour, crunchy larvae. A place where, at certain times of year, birds' eggs can be quietly lifted from nests. Each of these resources alone is small. Together, they form a safety net. Plants were probably the backbone of that net. Roots and tubers full of starch, greens and shoots rich in micronutrients, fruits when they were in season, nuts packed with fat and protein. Many of these raw plants are hard to chew, hard to digest, laced with mild toxins or irritants. Fire and patience can transform them. Roasting a tuber breaks down tough fibers. Leaching bitter seeds in running water carries away poisons. Pounding nuts or seeds with stone mortars makes them easier for the gut to handle. Layered on top of that plant base were animal foods, but here too, drama was the exception, not the rule. Opportunistic hunting and scavenging were likely constant threads. A hare flushed from cover, a trapped animal finished off with a club, a newborn antelope taken when the mother is distracted, a fish stunned in a shrinking pool at the end of the dry season. If a large animal fell, a deer, a wild horse, an antelope, that was a windfall. But windfalls, by definition, are not everyday events. Small stuff matters more than our imaginations usually allow. Lizards, frogs, snails, insects, birds, rodents. In many traditional foraging societies recorded in recent centuries, women and older children supplied the majority of daily calories not with spears, but with digging sticks, baskets, and keen eyes. The day's food, then, came from a mosaic of choices, a little bit here, a little bit there, guided by detailed memory of where things grew, crawled, nested, or burrowed last year, and the year before that. Over all of this, quietly shaping what was possible, was fire. The band might not have been able to make fire from scratch in every era. Controlled use of naturally occurring fire came first, deliberate ignition came later, but once a flame existed, keeping it alive was a priority. Coals were buried in ash to smoulder through the night, carried from camp to camp in bark containers or hollowed wood. A sudden rainstorm didn't just mean we'll be wet, it meant we could lose the fire. Fire turned marginal foods into staples by pre-digesting them outside the body. Cooking breaks down tough plant cell walls and denatures proteins. It means you get more energy out of the same mouthful, with less time spent chewing and less strain on the gut. Over evolutionary time, that extra energy can feed larger brains and longer childhoods. Over the course of a single evening, it means fewer hours gnawing and more hours talking. Fire also pushed back the night. Without artificial light, darkness comes quickly and thoroughly. The small halo of flame around the camp was warmth. Yes, but it was also a social space. People drifted in and out of that circle, eating, mending, gently arguing, telling stories, humming half-remembered songs. Children nodded off at the edges and were carried to sleeping places. Embers were stirred. Someone added more wood, not just to keep the temperature up, but to stretch out the day a little longer, to finish one more story. And then there is the simple fact of safety. In many ecosystems, large predators avoid open flame. A ring of firebrands placed around a sleeping area, the smell of smoke on hair and skins, the crackle and glow at the heart of the camp, all of this would have discouraged at least some nocturnal visitors. Not perfectly, not always, but enough to shift the odds night after night. If food and fire set the terms of the day, water set the map. A band did not wander randomly across the landscape. Movement was tightly coupled to known water sources. Permanent springs, reliable rivers, seepage spots where water could be dug from the sand, seasonal pools that only existed after certain rains. Water knowledge was not abstract geography, it was embodied memory. An elder might know that in late dry season, a particular bend of a river becomes brackish and unsafe, but 2 days' walk upriver, a side stream still runs clear. Someone else knows where a hidden spring can be reached only by a steep scramble, and that the path is lethal in heavy rain. A midwife remembers which pools became mosquito-ridden at a certain time of year, and quietly urges a move before fevers start. Travel plans wrapped themselves around that watery skeleton. A day's march had to be plotted so that children, nursing mothers, elders and dogs could all make it to the next drink. In some environments, water had to be carried, gourds, skins, woven containers lined with pitch or resins. In others, people moved like migrating animals, chaining their route from source to source. When water was scarce, choices narrowed. Camps shrank, fissioned, foraging radii widened, meaning more time away from the security of the hearth, more walking to convert into the simple act of drinking. Against that background of constraints, humans did something subtle but profound. They began to shift some of their food and water security from hope it's there tomorrow to make sure it is. This is where storage comes in. Not barns or granaries yet, but smaller, furtive steps. Meat from a large kill might be dried on racks, smoked slowly over banked fires, or cached in cool crevices, high branches or shallow pits lined with leaves and stones. Fat could be rendered and stored in skins or bladders. In colder regions, frozen ground itself became a kind of natural refrigerator. Archaeologists find hints of this in repeated use of particular rock shelters that seem to have been return points, in concentrations of bones that suggest systematic drying and transport of meat, in pits that show signs of having held food rather than bodies. Plant foods could be cached too, bundles of nuts stashed under rocks, dried tubers tucked into cracks, seeds stored in baskets hung beyond the reach of most scavengers. Not every experiment would have worked. Some caches would be raided by animals, spoiled by moisture, forgotten when a band was pushed off its usual range. But even the attempt changes the logic of survival. You are no longer only reacting to today's hunger, you are actively smoothing out tomorrow's risks. You eat a little less of the windfall now, in order to have something when the lean weeks come. That requires not just technical skill, but trust. Trust that your bandmates will honour shared caches, that they will not quietly strip them while you are away. And around all this, like a slow tide, moved the rhythm of the day. In many environments, the cool hours just after dawn were prime time. People rose from sleep that had not been a single unbroken stretch, but a patchwork, dozing, waking, tending the fire, nursing a baby drifting off again. Light grew, embers were coaxed back into flame, a small morning meal, leftovers, quickly roasted bits, something easy. Then parties formed and dispersed, some headed out with digging sticks and baskets, Some tracked sign from the day before, following faint hoofprints, distant calls. Some stayed close. Older people, small children, those recovering from illness, those working on tools or clothing. Midday heat brought a pause where it was intense, a retreat to shade, a chance to nap. In cooler climates the work continued, but slowly, always with an eye on the sun's arc and the distance back to camp. By late afternoon, people were drifting home, loads on their backs, stories on their tongues about what they'd seen. A new track, a changing waterhole, a clump of plants, almost ready to harvest. Success meant richer stews, more laughter. Failure meant quiet recalculations. Tomorrow we range farther. Tomorrow we try the other valley. As darkness fell and the fire brightened, the band's scattered efforts reconverged into shared time. Food was cooked, parcelled out, eaten. Children were shushed, and then allowed to run wild in the half-light, then finally pulled in and settled. Arguments from the day either fled briefly around the flames, or were smoothed over with a joke and a gesture of meat offered. Eventually, one by one, people lay down, some close to the fire, some a little further out. There was no strict bedtime, no synchronized lights out, just a gradual quieting punctuated by low voices, the crack of a settling log, the shift of a sleeping dog, the occasional startle of someone half-waking to tend the coals. In that ebb and flow, searching and returning, eating and resting, watching and dozing, our species spent untold nights. No cities, no clocks, just food, fire, water, and the shared awareness that tomorrow the pattern would repeat, with small variations, new risks, and new chances. Within that seemingly simple rhythm, something else was happening, the slow, cumulative refinement of tools. Each day's foraging and cooking and caching depended on shaped stones, carved wood, worked bone. To see how deep that quiet revolution went, we have to follow a single hand as it picks up an unpromising rock and begins to strike. At first glance, it doesn't look like much. A person squats near the edge of camp, a pile of stones at their feet, another stone in their hand. Tap, turn, tap. A few thin chips fall away. Children glance over, lose interest, wander off. It seems like background noise, but that quiet tapping is one of the deepest revolutions in human history. For a very long time, stone technology changed slowly. Early humans had made simple choppers, heavy hand axes, rough flakes that could cut, but not with much finesse. Useful, but blunt, in every sense of the word. Over hundreds of thousands of years that started to shift. Knappers learned to see inside a rock. Instead of just hitting it and hoping for the best, they began to prepare cores with care, shaping them so that each blow would detach a flake of a particular size and shape. From those cores came blades, long, narrow flakes with sharp, regular edges. Suddenly, a single rock could produce many tools, each designed for something specific, one thin blade for cutting meat, a thicker flake for scraping hides, a tiny point for piercing. This wasn't trial and error in the moment. It was the physical expression of a mental template. The napper already knew, before the first strike, what kind of tool the core should yield in the end. That template lived in minds, not in bones. Different regions developed their own traditions. One valley favoured leaf-shaped spear points with delicate retouch. Another produced squat scrapers with steep edges. To an untrained eye, it's all just stone tools. To someone growing up in that culture, the differences would have been obvious, as distinct as accents in speech. Those styles mattered. They signalled who you were, where you had learned, which networks your band belonged to. A particular way of shaping a blade could be a quiet announcement. We are the people from the river, not the people from the hills. As stone tools grew more refined, something else began to appear. Tools made not from one material, but from many. Imagine taking a sharp stone point and attaching it to the end of a wooden shaft. To make that work, you have to do several things in a particular order. First, you select a branch or sapling that will flex without snapping. You strip the bark, smooth the surface, maybe straighten it over steam or gentle heat. Then U-shape the base of the stone so it will fit the wood. Notches chipped just so, a slight thinning here or there. The shaft gets carved to match, a receiving groove or split that will cradle the point. Now you need something to hold them together. Sinew from an animal's leg, plant fibers, rawhide strips. These must be prepared, cleaned, twisted, sometimes softened in water before they can be wrapped tight. And to truly lock the joint, you add glue. The earliest adhesives were simple and brilliant. Pine or birch resin heated until it softens, then let cool to a tacky mass. Plant gums mixed with ash. In some cases, combinations of minerals and organics that behave differently at different temperatures. This is chemistry, discovered through long observation. Learning that if you overheat resin, it becomes brittle. If you mix in a little powdered charcoal, it gains strength. If you warm it just enough when it starts to crack, you can reform the joint. The finished product, a hafted spear, a knife with a handle, a scraper bound into a wooden grip, looks ordinary to us. But hidden inside it is a chain of linked steps, each depending on the success of the last. That chain lives across time. You can't improvise it fully in a single afternoon. You have to remember what worked last season and the season before that. You have to watch someone else do it. You have to teach it. Stone survives well in the ground, so it dominates our picture of the past. But for people living then, stone was only one piece of a larger toolkit. Bone and antler, for instance, were miracles of ready-made structure. Long, straight elements, already tough and slightly flexible. A napper might sit beside a carver, one showered in stone flakes, the other scraping, rasping, polishing a length of antler into a smooth, pointed awl. Bone points could pierce hides without tearing them. Fish hooks carved from bone opened up rivers and coasts in new ways. Barbed harpoons made from antler or bone allowed hunters to latch onto a thrashing animal or a struggling seal and not lose it in a single instant of bad luck. Then there was wood, the most ubiquitous and almost the most invisible. Digging sticks hardened in the fire, their tips charred and scraped to a point, turned shallow roots into a dependable resource. Throwing sticks shaped to fly flat and far could bring down birds or small mammals. Simple clubs and staves provided defense and leverage. In many day-to-day tasks, wood would have been the first choice. It's quieter than stone, warmer to the touch, easier to replace. But outside of exceptional conditions, waterlogging, deep caves, frozen ground, it vanishes without a trace. We only glimpse it indirectly, in the wear patterns on stone, in the polish inside a bone socket that once held a wooden shaft. All of these tools lived in motion. A spear point wasn't used once and discarded. It was resharpened, its edge restored again and again, slowly shrinking with each repair. A broken blade could be recycled into a smaller knife, then a drill, then perhaps a tiny scraper for fine work. People carried personal toolkits the way many of us carry bags or pockets today. A small, curated selection of things that could solve many problems. A few cores that could be refreshed into new flakes. A prized blade wrapped in leather. A bit of resin protected in a lump of bark. A bone needle threaded through a strip of hide. Mobility made this culture of maintenance essential. If your band might move tomorrow, you couldn't count on heavy fixed installations. You needed objects that could be mended in the field, reshaped on the move, endlessly repurposed. This constant repair work did something to human attention. It trained people to see potential in fragments, to think ahead. If you ruin this core now, you won't have it when you really need it 2 days from now, on the far side of a dry stretch with no good stone. Behind all of this stands a quiet but immense structure: teaching. Standardized tool traditions stretching over hundreds of miles don't appear because each person reinvented the technique from scratch. They appear because knowledge flowed across families, across bands, across generations. An experienced napper might let a child sit close, handing them the discarded flakes to play with, correcting their grip long before they were trusted with a real core. A teenager might spend long seasons watching, then trying, then failing, gradually internalizing how hard to strike, at what angle, how to read the hidden fractures in the stone. This is apprenticeship in its most ancient form. No written manuals, no diagrams, just repeated demonstration and guided practice. And just as stone styles could signal identity, so could the ways those skills were taught. A particular twist in a binding, a favoured glue recipe, a characteristic notch on a spear point. All of these marked not just a tool, but a lineage of teachers and students. If you picked up a stranger's knife at a meeting between bands, you might recognise the technique. Ah, this comes from the people beyond the ridge. Their cousins passed through last spring. They're good hunters. They know where the herds move. In that way, tools became more than objects. They were tokens of connection. A blade traded from hand to hand could carry news of distant places. An admired spear point might inspire imitation, spreading a new design along the same routes that carried stories and mates. The quiet tapping at the edge of camp, then, was never just about making a sharp edge. It was about weaving together memory, skill, chemistry, identity and trust. Before there were cities, before there were ploughs or palaces, there were hands striking stone, binding points to wood, carving bone. In that modest, repetitive work, our ancestors were slowly rewiring the world. And with better tools, new possibilities for comfort and protection opened up. Once you can reliably cut, scrape and pierce, you can do more than kill an animal. You can turn its skin into shelter and clothing, and build small pockets of warmth against an often hostile climate. On a mild night, it's easy to forget how dangerous air can be. Not the air itself, but its temperature, its movement. A still evening with no wind, no rain, and a clear sky is pleasant for us. For most of our species' history, a night like that without protection could be deadly. Skin alone is not enough to live through Ice Age winters, high mountain winds, or long rains that soak everything you own. Our ancestors did not simply tough it out any more than a polar bear survives by ignoring the cold. They did something far more interesting. They built little pockets of climate around their bodies and their camps. Clothing is one of the most important of those pockets, and also one of the most invisible in the archaeological record. Stone survives. Bone can survive. Leather, fur, woven plant fibres, those tend to rot away. In a handful of extraordinary sites, in dry caves and frozen ground, we get hints, fragments of twisted cord, traces of fur, impressions of textiles on clay. But compared with the oceans of stone tools, it's almost nothing. And yet, without clothing, those stone tools couldn't have carried people very far into Ice Age Europe, Siberia, or high-altitude plateaus. The distribution of human fossils and campsites in cold regions is itself a kind of shadow evidence, if people were living there year after year, bearing children, raising them. They must have had good protection from the cold. You can't raise a baby in a blizzard with bare skin. Hides were the starting point. Every large animal brought back to camp was not just meat, bone and sinew. It was also a sheet of potential shelter. But turning a raw hide into something you can wear comfortably is hard work. Fresh skin is heavy, wet and stiff when it dries. Left alone, it becomes something like a warped board. To make it supple, people scraped away the flesh and fat with stone scrapers, then worked the hide over and over, stretching, twisting, sometimes rubbing in animal brains or oils. Smoke from a smouldering fire could finish the process, helping to preserve the leather and make it more resistant to water. This was not a quick afternoon task. It was a multi-day project, often done in stages repeated throughout the year. Out of that labour came cloaks, wraps, and eventually sewn garments that wrapped closely around the body, trapping warm air. Sewing itself was quiet but revolutionary. Early on, people probably used awls, pointed bone tools to poke holes and then threaded sinew or plant fibre through by hand. Later, in some regions, we find something astonishing: eyed needles carved from bone or ivory. A needle that can carry thread through a tiny hole allows finer stitching, tighter seams, and more complex shapes. You can make sleeves that fit at the wrist, hoods that hug the face, leggings that seal around the ankle. You can quilt padding between layers, build multiple skins into one garment, and repair small tears before they become catastrophic failures in a storm. These needles don't show up in the record until tens of thousands of years ago, and mostly in colder regions, which makes sense. In mild climates you can get by with wraps and loose folds. In a blizzard, the difference between a crude cloak and a fitted, layered outfit is the difference between walking and freezing. Insulation wasn't just about fur either. People learned how to trap air, between layers of hide, in bundles of plant fibres, in padded boots or moccasins filled with dry grass. They were, whether they thought of it this way or not, mastering the physics of heat loss. Every piece of clothing added a thin, portable layer of microclimate. A person wrapped properly in winter gear carried a small, warm habitat around with them. The same thinking extended beyond the body to the way they built shelters. At the simplest end there are windbreaks, a line of brush piled against the prevailing wind, a low wall of stones, a screen of branches leaning against each other. These structures don't look impressive in a reconstruction, but step behind one on a cold, gusty day, and the difference is immediate. Wind steals heat from skin far faster than still air. Cut the wind, and you've already built a better world. More elaborate shelters followed in treeless plains. Mammoth bones and tusks could form a framework for domes, covered with hides and turf. In forested areas, people lashed together, bent saplings, layered branches and leaves, then sealed the whole thing with skins. There were likely tent-like structures made from long poles and large hides, light enough to take down and move with the group. Caves enter the story too, but not as simple holes where people lived in darkness. A cave is a complex environment. Cold air sinks, dampness pools, smoke behaves strangely. A group moving into a cave had to learn which parts flooded in heavy rain, where air currents would pull smoke out, where the floor stayed dry and warmest. A cave, in other words, became a house only when people tamed its internal climate, blocking drafts with walls of stone or hide, placing hearths where their warmth would radiate effectively, using raised areas and platforms to sleep off the cold ground. Wherever they camped in caves, under rock overhangs, in tents on open ground, people were arranging space with comfort in mind. Archaeologists sometimes find traces of this in the distribution of artefacts and ash. Hearths clustered in particular areas, with zones of toolmaking nearby. Patches of preserved plant remains that look like they were once bedding, layers of grass, leaves, or rushes laid down, sometimes with insect-repelling species mixed in. Sleeping directly on earth pulls warmth out of the body. A simple layer of dry material interrupts that flow, traps air, and suddenly the same fire feels twice as effective. Add furs or skins on top, and you've created a bed. The layout around the fire mattered too. A central hearth with sleeping areas fanning out around it, maybe with older people or infants closest to the heat. Work zones where sparks and smoke wouldn't interfere. Storage spots where food and tools could be kept dry and accessible. Night after night, these arrangements trained people to think spatially about comfort. Where to put warmth, where to put sleeping bodies, where to keep smoke away from lungs and eyes. For highly mobile groups, comfort couldn't all be fixed in place. It had to move with them. That's where bags, slings, and containers come in. We rarely find the bags themselves, but we do find the things that went in them, carefully curated toolkits, and sometimes the objects that formed their structure. Net weights, bone rings, small carved toggles used to fasten straps. In waterlogged or frozen sites, fragments of woven plant fibre or twisted cords hint at nets, carrying straps, maybe even simple backpacks. Soft leather bags could hold food, embers nested in ash to carry fire from camp to camp, precious lumps of resin, the bone needle that kept your clothes together. Rigid containers, hollowed gourds, carved wood, sections of horn could protect water, fat, or delicate tools. For a mother walking with an infant, a sling or wrap meant the difference between putting a baby down in the dirt or keeping it close, warm and safe, while still having hands free. For an old teacher, a bag of tools meant knowledge that could travel, ready to be unpacked in the next camp. Taken together, these technologies of comfort did more than make life pleasant. They reshaped survival itself. Good clothing and shelter reduce the energy the body spends just staying warm or cool. That means more calories available for growth, for healing, for pregnancy and lactation. Babies kept warm at night are more likely to live. Adults who sleep well and stay dry resist infection better, think more clearly, and can hunt or gather more effectively. Over many generations, small improvements in warmth and rest add up to something large. More surviving children, more elders who remember old roots and stories, more spare time in the evenings and winters, when people are not just shivering in the dark, but awake, talking, making things. That spare time is where we start to see other human activities blossom. Careful tool-making, intricate ornaments, the first experiments with pigments and decoration, the long conversations that turn into stories and rituals. A well-insulated camp doesn't just shield bodies, it shelters culture. Clothing, bedding, tents, caves shaped into homes, bags holding a tiny travelling world of tools and memories. All of these are ways our ancestors bent harsh environments to human needs. They built microclimates in which not only bodies could survive, but minds could wander. And once people could reliably carry their comfort with them, they could also carry it farther. The same furs, tents, and ember-filled containers that made a winter valley livable also made the next valley, and the one beyond it, possible. Step by step, wrapped in skins and carrying their small pockets of warmth, our ancestors walked out into new lands. Those movements, multiplied over thousands of years, would eventually stretch from African savannas to Arctic coasts. To follow them, we have to turn from the small circle of the hearth to the long lines across the map, the paths, seasons, and migrations that carried humans into almost every corner of the planet. Once people could pack up warmth, shelter, and fire and carry them, the world stopped being a set of fixed traps and refuges. It became a map, not a paper map, of course, a mental one. Lines of remembered rivers, gaps in the mountains, a certain bend of coastline where the fish always seemed to run, a lonely hill that rose above the mist and could be seen from days away. These became the coordinates your ancestors used to move through landscapes no one had ever written down. When we talk about humans leaving Africa, it's easy to picture one heroic march, a single band striding out of the cradle of humanity and fanning across the world. The reality was slower, messier, and stranger. For hundreds of thousands of years, human populations expanded and contracted, moved and retreated in pulses that matched the slow heartbeat of the Ice Age climate. When conditions in a region improved, more rain, more grass, more animals, people pushed out, exploring new valleys and coasts. When the climate swung back to cold or drought, some of those advances collapsed. Groups split, merged, or vanished. Others fell back toward the old refuges. Out of Africa wasn't a door that closed behind them. It was a threshold crossed again and again. The big dispersal that ultimately leads to you, sitting here now, seems to have begun around 60 to 70,000 years ago, when one branch of African Homo sapiens moved into what is now the Arabian Peninsula. But there were probably earlier attempts. Fossils and stone tools in the Levant, and perhaps even as far as China, suggest that humans, or at least human-like populations, had left Africa in smaller waves long before, then died out or were absorbed. Think of it less as a single exodus and more as a tide. It rises a little higher each time. Some waves fall back. Others climb over the old line and keep going. Once out of Africa, there were two great highways, inland corridors and coastal routes. The inland paths followed what animals had already mapped. Herds seek water and grazing, and people followed them up river valleys, across open steppe, through passes in mountain ranges. The great rivers of the Old World, the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus, weren't just sources of water, they were living, moving guides. If you keep a river on one side, you can't get too lost. Archaeological sites far from coasts, with sequences of tools and camps that stretch over tens of thousands of years, show these inland expansions. People pushed into the Levant, then deeper into Eurasia, eventually reaching Europe and Central Asia. Each step wasn't a grand march, but a group shifting camp to a slightly better valley, a slightly richer hunting ground, a little further into what had once been blank space on their internal map. At the same time, another set of groups may have hugged the coasts. Shallow shorelines are rich: shellfish, fish in tidal pools, seabirds, edible seaweeds, driftwood for fires. For mobile foragers, a coastline is almost a conveyor belt of resources. There is growing evidence that some early modern humans moved eastward along the southern edge of Asia, skirting the Arabian shores, then the coasts of India, Southeast Asia, and eventually reaching Australia far earlier than once assumed. The catch is that Ice Age coastlines are often buried now, drowned under seas that rose when the last great ice sheets melted. So we're working from hints, sites not far from modern coasts with heavy use of marine foods, distinctive stone tools scattered like breadcrumbs along the route, and the genetics of the people who live in these regions today. Coastal and inland routes weren't mutually exclusive. They braided and rejoined. A group that had followed rivers might hit an estuary and discover the sea. A coastal band might move inland along a fertile valley, then return to the shoreline generations later. Over deep time, humans treated continents less like rigid barriers and more like tapestries of paths. To move in these ways, they navigated with more than just their feet. Landmarks were everything: a solitary rock outcrop that looked like an animal, a notch in a ridgeline where the sun set at midsummer, a particular tree shaped by wind. These features became anchor points in memory. Over time, these memories turned into stories. You don't tell your children travel 80 kilometers northwest until you intersect the tributary. You say, walk until the mountain that looks like a sleeping lion appears on your left. When the river splits like a fork, follow the branch that sings louder. Embedded in myth and tale were directions for real journeys, where the springs never dry, where the snow lingers, where other people are usually friendly, and where ghosts or enemies wait. At night, the sky became a second map. Even without written astronomy, the regular motions of stars are hard to miss if you sleep outdoors your whole life. Certain constellations rise over particular mountains at specific seasons. A bright star might mark the general direction of a good wintering ground. People could have learned to orient themselves by these patterns, checking their course against a sky that was both familiar and full of stories. These mental maps, sung and spoken from elder to child, were as important as any tool. Lose a spear, and you can make another. Lose your roots, and a whole band could vanish in a bad year. Genetics gives us another view of these journeys, but it speaks in a slow statistical language. When a small group breaks off from a larger population and moves into a new land, they carry with them only a slice of the original genetic variation. This is called a founder effect. Whatever random assortment of genes those pioneers happen to have, eye pigments, immune system quirks, tolerance for certain foods, becomes the starting palette for everyone who descends from them. Over thousands of years, as these descendants spread and sometimes become isolated, their gene pool can drift further from the source. Certain variants become common, not because they are better, but because they were simply there at the beginning. Others vanish entirely, layer on top of that new bottlenecks periods when even these descendant populations are squeezed by disease, disaster or climate shifts, and you get the complex branching genetic history we see today, echoes of old separations and reunions written into every cell. But this process was never one way. Groups didn't just leave, multiply, and never look back. They met others. They merged. They split again. Some bands that had gone far might turn around after a run of bad seasons, retracing a path back toward older, safer territories. Others might linger at crossroads for generations, becoming mixtures of different lineages, different traditions. Movement was not a single arrow across a map. It was a restless weaving. Water, which we often treat as a barrier in modern maps, was part of that weaving surprisingly early. To reach Australia by at least 50 to 65,000 years ago, humans had to cross stretches of open water, even when sea levels were lower. They didn't need great ships, but they did need something that floated. Rafts of logs, bundles of reeds, dug-out canoes. Even a few successful crossings repeated over generations would have been enough to carry people, fire, tools and stories to new shores. There are hints of similarly early water crossings in the islands of Southeast Asia, in the obsidian of offshore islands that somehow appears in mainland sites, in genetic traces that suggest populations moved between separated landmasses long before sailors existed in any modern sense. For your ancestors, a narrow strait wasn't an impossible wall. It was a challenge, a risk to be managed with wood, fibre, courage, and maybe a prayer. Over tens of thousands of years, this combination of portable comfort, mental maps, cautious boldness, and sheer persistence carried humans into deserts, forests, high plateaus, and coasts from Africa to Eurasia to Australia, and eventually, much later, into the Americas. Every valley that feels ancient to us, every meadow that seems like it has always had people in it, was once new ground seen for the first time by someone whose only guides were remembered hills, stars, the smell of water on the wind, and a story an old relative told by the fire. Those stories carried people to the edges of the old world. At those edges they began to meet others, humans who had taken different paths through the same long night. Neanderthals, Denisovans, and perhaps still other cousins, already at home in places our ancestors were only just learning to read. When your ancestors finally stepped into these new lands, they were not walking into emptiness. They were walking into neighbourhoods that already had residents. Those neighbours were not animals in the usual sense. They were people. Different people. We call one of these groups Neanderthals. They had been in Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans arrived, shaped patiently by cold winters, patchy forests and open steppe. Their bones tell a clear story. Shorter, stockier bodies, thick ribs and limb bones that speak of tremendous strength. Faces pulled a little forward with broad noses that could warm icy air before it reached their lungs. They were not cavemen in the cartoon sense. They used caves when they were useful, like everyone else, but they also built shelters, controlled fire, hunted large animals, and cared for their sick and injured. For a very long time, Neanderthals were the dominant humans in Europe and parts of Western Asia. When our ancestors were still confined to Africa, Neanderthals had already weathered multiple ice ages. Further east in Asia, there were other cousins we call Denisovans. We know them mainly from fragments: a finger bone from a Siberian cave, a jaw from the Tibetan plateau, a few teeth. But their DNA is a loud voice, echoing in the genomes of people in East Asia, in the Pacific, in parts of the Himalayas. Those genetic traces tell us Denisovans weren't rare oddities. They were a widespread, successful human population, comfortable in environments ranging from tropical islands to high mountain plateaus. So when modern humans spread out of Africa and along the coasts and river corridors, they were entering a world already partitioned, in a loose way, between these cousins. Europe and Western Asia, largely Neanderthal country. Eastern Asia and island Southeast Asia, Denisovan territories, with fuzzy shifting borders. Africa, still the homeland of our own lineage, though perhaps not entirely free of older ghosts. What happened when these worlds touched is one of the most intriguing and frustrating questions in all of human history. We know, first of all, that they met close enough to have children together. Almost every person today whose ancestry traces outside of Africa carries a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA. Many people in parts of Asia and Oceania also carry bits of Denisovan DNA. These aren't one-off accidents. Geneticists see evidence of multiple episodes of interbreeding, separated in time and space, encounters in the Middle East, encounters further east, possibly encounters as far south as island Southeast Asia. This tells us some simple things. When these different humans saw each other, they recognized each other as potential mates. With no shared language at first, no shared traditions, bodies still spoke a common grammar. Gesture, expression, touch. But what it doesn't tell us is just as important. Interbreeding doesn't automatically mean peaceful integration. It doesn't tell us whether these children were raised in loving, mixed families or as captives. It doesn't tell us if bands lived side by side for generations, sharing hunting grounds, or whether most meetings were tense, rare, and dangerous. Genes record that bodies mixed. They are mostly silent about the feelings, the bargains, the rivalries. We have to imagine the social part carefully and humbly. Think of the landscape first. Two human species using similar tools, hunting many of the same animals, gathering many of the same plants. That sets the stage for competition. If a valley can only support so many hunters, and a new group arrives, something has to give. But nature allows more than one outcome. One possibility is niche partitioning. Neanderthals might have favoured certain prey, big game in open terrain, for example, while Homo sapiens experimented more with smaller animals, fish or plant foods. Denisovans in high-altitude regions might have specialised in mountain resources, while incoming groups stuck first to the lower valleys. Even small differences in preferred prey, or in the seasons when different resources were used, could soften direct conflict. Another possibility is a patchwork of coexistence and exclusion. A river valley held by Neanderthals for centuries, surrounded by hills where modern humans begin to appear. A coastline used by one species in winter, another in summer. Trade and cautious visits along the edges, perhaps, with boundaries policed by custom and memory. Sometimes that balance probably broke down. Evidence of injuries on Neanderthal skeletons hints at close-quarters violence, though we can't always tell whether that was from hunting dangerous animals or fighting other humans. Your ancestors were capable of both hospitality and brutality, just as we are now. Underneath all this lies an old debate. Were we, modern humans, somehow mentally different from our cousins? Smarter, more symbolic, better at language? For a long time, the story was told in simple terms. Modern humans, creative, artistic, talkative. Neanderthals and Denisovans, clever animals, but lacking true symbolism. That story grows weaker every year. Neanderthals buried their dead in ways that suggest care, and possibly ritual. They used pigments like ochre and black manganese dioxide, sometimes on shells or objects that look suspiciously like ornaments. There are hints of etched patterns, perforated animal teeth, even possible flute-like bones. Not as abundant or as flamboyant as later Homo sapiens art, but enough to make it hard to deny them some kind of symbolic life. From Denisovans, the archaeological picture is even thinner, but their genetic legacy includes sophisticated adaptations, genes that help with high-altitude life, processing low oxygen efficiently, genes that seem linked to immunity, perhaps shaped by long battles with local diseases. These speak to deep knowledge of their environments, even if we don't yet have their art on cave walls. So any simple hierarchy, us above, them below, doesn't really hold up. There were differences, yes, but also shared capacities. Maybe the real distinction wasn't whether they could think symbolically, but how their societies were organized around that thinking. Modern human bands seem to have built especially dense networks of exchange and alliance, passing ideas rapidly across long distances. Once that kind of network exists, small advantages in communication or memory can snowball into rapid cultural change. And this is where knowledge transfer comes in. When a modern human band wandered into a Neanderthal-inhabited valley, they weren't just meeting new competitors. They were meeting people who already knew that land intimately, where the waterholes lasted longest in drought years, which cliffs sheltered nesting birds where the herds tended to cross the river. It would have been foolish not to learn from that. Some techniques may have moved from one species to another, specific ways of working stone, particular hunting strategies, perhaps even methods of preserving meat or treating injuries. It's entirely possible that some modern human tricks were borrowed from Neanderthals or Denisovans and vice versa, then carried far away from their place of origin. When geneticists find that a Denisovan-derived gene helps modern Tibetans live at altitude, that's one kind of borrowed knowledge written in DNA. There may have been parallel cases in tools and customs, invisible loans across species lines, paid back in children and shared survival. The hard truth is that the record is patchy. A handful of bones, scattered tools, fragments of caves. From these we are trying to reconstruct delicate things. Friendships, rivalries, lessons learned around someone else's fire. Every new find has the power to rewrite the story. What does seem clear is that, for a long time, the world was not us versus them. It was a braided human tapestry, Neanderthal bands in their snow-dusted valleys, Denisovan groups in high passes and island forests, modern humans weaving in from the south, all shaped by the same ancient bottleneck, all making lives in the shifting climates of the Ice Age. For tens of thousands of years, their worlds overlapped. Children were born who carried mixed ancestries, who might have moved easily between bands, translating customs, sharing songs whose words we will never know. Then, slowly, that tapestry unravelled. Neanderthals disappeared from the fossil record around 40,000 years ago. Denisovans fade even more quietly. Only one human species remains in the end, but not a pure, isolated line, a mosaic carrying traces of all the others. The next part of the story lives not in bones, but in sound. How these different humans may have spoken, remembered, and imagined their way through shared landscapes. To follow that trail, we have to listen for something that never fossilizes at all: language, story, and the long memory of the mind. Language doesn't leave teeth marks on bones or neat layers in the soil. It vanishes as soon as the breath that carries it is gone. So how can we say anything about the speech of people who lived 50,000 years ago, or 100,000, or more? We have to work backwards from the shadows it casts. One kind of shadow is anatomical. Inside the skull, the shape of the brain case, the base, the space for the tongue and throat muscles. In the neck, the hyoid bone that helps support the tongue. Neanderthals had a modern-looking hyoid, a modern-looking ear tuned to the same frequencies we use in speech, and brain regions similar in size and layout to ours. The same is true for early Homo sapiens fossils going back well beyond 100,000 years. Another shadow is genetic. There are genes that influence how our brains develop, how we control our mouths and tongues. Some of these, like FOXP2, appear in similar forms in Neanderthals and in us. That doesn't prove they spoke like we do, but it suggests the hardware for complex vocal learning and sequencing was already there before our line split from theirs. And then there's the archaeological shadow, behaviours that simply don't make sense without sophisticated communication. Standardized tools appearing over wide areas, delicate hunting strategies that require careful coordination, long-distance trade in materials and pigments, ritual burials repeated in similar ways over thousands of years. You don't get that kind of patterned, cumulative culture if every generation is starting from scratch, or if people can only grunt and point. You get it when words are being passed down, questions asked, mistakes corrected, stories told. So most researchers now think that by the time our ancestors were walking out of Africa and meeting Neanderthals and Denisovans, all these humans already had rich, flexible ways of speaking. Maybe not modern English, but something capable of gossip, instruction, argument, and myth. What did they use this invisible technology for? Imagine a band on the move across a vast landscape. No maps, no written notes. The only guide is what people remember and how they can share that memory. Story becomes the navigation system. An elder might not say, "The spring is at latitude X." Instead, when you see the hill that looks like a sleeping animal, walk toward its nose until the ground changes colour. Dig where the soil turns red, and the water will find your hands. A child hears that story 100 times before ever making the journey. When they finally walk that path as an adult, the landscape feels already known, wrapped in narrative. Law, too, can be a story. There is no written code, no police. Rules live in tales of what happened the last time someone broke them. A boy who refused to share meat and later starved when no one shared with him. A woman who lied about a hunting ground and was left behind when the group moved. Told and retold, these aren't just entertainments. They are social software running quietly in people's heads, shaping behaviour. Identity is threaded through the same loom. A night by the fire becomes an occasion to hear who you are. We are the people who crossed the big water when the ice broke. We are the children of the woman who tamed the fire that burned for 3 days. Our cousins live beyond the mountain where the sun rests. These narratives are not precise history in the modern sense, but they anchor belonging. They tell each child, you are part of something that began before you and will go on after you. Perhaps the most urgent function of story is ecological knowledge. Which plants heal and which kill when to dig for roots. How to read the timing of bird migrations or insect swarms. Where the herd usually turns when the river runs low. These are not random tips. They are networks of relationships in time and space, too complex to keep as raw data. So they become characters and plots. The plant with leaves like a lizard's back will steal your breath if you eat it on an empty stomach. The antelope with the torn ear always leads the herd to the western ford when the moon is thin. Dress information in images and rhythm, and it becomes unforgettable. Children absorb it long before they fully grasp its practical meaning. All of this depends on a peculiar human trick, the ability to build culture cumulatively. Other animals can imitate. Young chimpanzees watch elders crack nuts with stones. Young dolphins copy clever hunting techniques, but there seems to be a limit. The techniques don't keep getting more elaborate over generations. Something different happens in our lineage. A child doesn't just copy what a parent does, they're explicitly instructed. Hold it like this. No, not that stone, this one. Listen to where the wind hits the rock. Then you'll know if an animal is inside the cave. Language lets us scaffold learning, layer nuance on top of observation. Once that feedback loop starts, imitation, teaching, tiny improvements, it accelerates. A sharpening trick learned by one hunter becomes standard practice in the band. A new knot for binding spearheads spreads to neighbouring groups through marriage ties and visiting. In a few generations, what was once an innovation becomes tradition. The baseline moves. Names are part of that cultural scaffolding. In a small band, knowing who is not optional. It is survival. Personal names let you talk about people when they aren't present. Praise them, warn about them, plan around them. They allow memory to reach across distance and time. Don't share hunting secrets with Lyra, she told a stranger last season. Ask Maku about the stars. His mother taught him when he was small. Kin terms go even deeper. Words like mother, mother's brother, father's sister's child may sound fussy, but they encode rules about obligation, alliance, and marriage. In many small-scale societies studied in recent centuries, these terms tell you instantly who you can joke with, who you must avoid, who you might someday marry. They are a built-in social map that every child carries in their head. Taboos are another layer of this invisible architecture. Some words are not spoken in certain contexts. Some names are avoided after death. Some animals are not mentioned before a hunt to prevent bad luck. These rules might start as practical tricks, keeping dangerous knowledge private or avoiding conflicts, but they become sacred customs, policed by shame and fear as much as by logic. Together, names, kin terms, and taboos form a kind of low-tech bureaucracy. They regulate behaviour and expectations without written law, without offices or documents. They allow groups of a few dozen people to maintain a coherent, shared order over decades. Sound itself carries some of this load. Alongside spoken language, there is music, rhythm, chant, humming. These leave even fewer traces in the ground than speech, but their roots may be very old. Mothers all over the world rock and murmur to soothe infants. The exact words differ, but the pattern, slow, repeating, soft, seems nearly universal. It's easy to imagine your distant ancestors doing the same. A lullaby is more than a tune. It is a tiny ritual that binds two nervous systems together. The baby's breathing syncs to the rhythm. The singer's voice slows their own heartbeat. In a dangerous world that calm matters, group music may have served similar functions. Coordinating work, keeping time during long walks, welding a hunting party into a single emotional unit before a risky chase. A simple beat, shared and repeated, can make many bodies move as one without anyone shouting orders. All of this speech, story, naming, taboo, song can be thought of as a technology. Not technology made of stone or bone, but of pattern and habit. It costs nothing to carry, yet it lets small human groups do something astonishing, coordinate at a scale far beyond immediate perception. You don't have to see every member of your band to cooperate with them. You only need to know your role in the stories, your place in the kinship web, the names of those you trust and those you fear. You can negotiate marriages with people you've never met because words carry reputations ahead of you. You can prepare for dangers you haven't yet faced because tales of past winters or past droughts are stored in the group mind. Civilizations much later would use writing, laws, officials, and archives to manage this complexity. Your Ice Age ancestors had none of that. What they had instead was language, a flexible, endlessly rewritable operating system running silently in the background of daily life. In the long, long stretch before cities, this was the most powerful invention on Earth. It grew slowly, invisibly, each new story adding a tiny line of code, each song strengthening a shared rhythm. While the glaciers advanced and retreated, while species met and mingled and vanished, the human voice was quietly knitting together memories, desires, and fears into something new, a shared world that existed not just outside, in rivers and rocks, but inside, in the space behind the eyes. From that shared inner world, new things would soon emerge. Images on stone, beads on string, marks on the body, and on the land. The first visible symbols of an already ancient invisible language. Once the inner world is rich enough, it starts leaking out. You can almost feel the pressure build, stories piling up, names, memories, rules, fears, hopes. At some point, the tongue and the ear aren't enough. People begin to mark things. They choose colours, shapes, patterns, and they fix them in place. This is where the archaeological record suddenly becomes more than tools and bones. It starts to show us hints of meaning. One of the quiet stars of this record is ochre, iron-rich earth, staining fingers and stone in shades of red, yellow, brown. People were collecting and using ochre at least 300,000 years ago, maybe earlier. In some caves there are grindstones smeared with red, lumps of pigment carried from miles away, neatly stored pieces scored with lines. What was it for? It could have been used on skin, to colour bodies or hair. It could have been mixed with fat and smeared on hides. It could have served as a preservative, or as insect repellent, or as a sunscreen of sorts. It might have marked the dead. It might have symbolised blood, or life, or status, or nothing of the kind. We don't know. Meanings don't fossilise, but the persistence does. For tens and hundreds of thousands of years, across different human species and continents, people kept seeking out this strange, useful, beautiful earth and altering it deliberately. They ground it, heated it, transported it. That regular effort suggests it mattered for more than one reason at once: practical, aesthetic, symbolic, all braided together. Beads tell a similar and slightly later story. Around 100,000 years ago, maybe earlier, in Africa and the Levant, we start finding small shells with holes worn through them, smoothed by friction against string or sinew. Some are marine shells found far inland, deliberately carried. Some were pierced with tools, many are stained with ochre. A single pierced shell could be an accident. Dozens of similar shells in similar layers, all with the same kind of wear, clustered near hearths, are almost certainly not. String them together in your mind. Think of them hanging around a neck, tied into hair, sewn along the edge of clothing. Now we are in the realm of body ornamentation, where the body becomes a moving surface for symbols. What do those beads say? They might signal belonging. I am one of the people who wear this kind of shell. They might mark life stages, children with one or two, adults with many, a certain pattern reserved for those who have gone through a painful initiation. They might show skill, a great hunter or an expert healer decorated by grateful relatives. Or they might be playful humans decorate for joy as well as for status. A child may love the way the shells click against each other when they run. Engravings are another faint line in the record. On pieces of ochre, on bone, on ivory, on soft stone, we see repeated patterns. Crosshatches, zigzags, parallel lines, sets of dots. Some are clearly byproducts of use. Others seem too carefully made, too symmetrical to be random. Were they numbers? Tallies of animals seen, or days past, or kills made? Were they clan marks, simple logos of identity? Were they idle doodles, someone passing time, enjoying the feel of incision and the emerging pattern? Here, too, we have to live with uncertainty. The same pattern might have meant different things to different people, or to the same group at different times. A mark could start as a private signature and turn into a shared emblem. Or the other way around. Later still come the more obvious candidates for art in the modern sense: figurines, shaped in stone, ivory and clay. Tiny stylized bodies with exaggerated features. Animals in the round, carefully carved. Many of these belong to the last 40,000 years, but the impulse to shape images by hand may be older. A smoothed pebble that happens to resemble a human form, picked up and cherished. A natural line in rock deepened and completed to look more like the animal someone already sees in it. Even with these figurines meaning slips through our fingers, Paleolithic Venus figures with swollen hips and breasts have been read as fertility idols, self-portraits, mythic ancestors, erotic toys, teaching aids, even simple experiments in carving. Any of those explanations might be partly right. None can be proven. If the small portable symbols are hard to interpret, the big ones are even harder and more haunting. Deep in caves in Europe, in Indonesia, in other scattered places, people left images on walls, animals, hand stencils, abstract signs. Many of these paintings and engravings cluster between about 45,000 and 20,000 years ago, but some are older, and there are suggestions that Neanderthals too may have marked cave walls. Why go into the dark to draw? One idea is that these places were ritual spaces, separated from daily life. The difficulty of reaching them, the crawling, climbing, squeezing through narrow passages might have been part of their power. Another is that cave walls served as great story surfaces where groups gathered during certain seasons to retell their shared past, mark hunts, renew bonds. Think of cave art as a place-based practice. A certain valley, a particular cave within it, specific chambers within that cave, used and revisited as the years cycle. Maybe the herd passes nearby in winter. Maybe people shelter there during storms. Every time they return, they see the old images and add new ones. Children grow up watching the same horses, bison, mammoths on the walls slowly multiply and overlap. The landscape outside and the images inside become linked in memory. Here is the bend in the river where we trapped the reindeer. Here is the cave where we painted them after. The cave is not just a hole in the rock. It is a memory palace, a seasonal meeting place, a canvas on which the group's stories accumulate. The paintings may have had many functions at once. They might have recorded animals seen, honoured animals killed, or called animals hoped for. They might have been connected to initiation rites, to trance states, to music and dance. Or they might also have contained the simple human joy of line, colour and form. Nothing in human life needs to have only one meaning. The same is true of the decorated body moving through that landscape. A line of ochre across a cheek, a pattern of scars on an arm, a certain hairstyle, a pendant made from a wolf's tooth, a bracelet of shell or bone, all of these can be social language. You can read them at a glance if you know the code. They can say, "I am old enough to marry," or "I have lost a child," or "My mother's people live beyond the ridge," or "I killed a dangerous animal and survived." They can show who belongs together, parents and children, ally bands, members of a ritual society, and who stands apart. In small groups, where everyone more or less knows everyone, this may seem unnecessary. But as networks grow, as marriage partners move between bands, as people meet strangers at seasonal gatherings, visible cues become useful shortcuts. They turn the skin into a passport, a resume, a family tree, all at once. When archaeologists sift a site and find clusters of similar beads, or consistent scar patterns on bones, or repeated combinations of ornaments in graves, they see more than decoration. They see people using symbols to manage the complexities of belonging without any centralized institution telling them how. This is perhaps the most important lesson of all these marks, beads, pigments, and carvings. Symbolism does not wait politely for civilization to appear. It doesn't require cities, writing, kings, or temples. By the time the first towns rise, humans have already been using colours, shapes, and patterns to think with and to think about each other for tens of thousands of years. We will never recover exactly what a spiral scratched into a bone meant to the person who made it, or what song went with the handprints on a cave wall, or what joke was shared when a necklace first settled around someone's neck. Those meanings dissolved with their languages and their lives, but the patterns that remain, the persistence of ochre, the spread of beads, The repetition of certain motifs, the careful choice of caves, tell us that our ancestors were already living in thick symbolic worlds. They saw identities, seasons, memories, and invisible relationships, not just in words, but in things. And those things, buried and forgotten, waited quietly in the dark for us to find them again. If symbols travel on skin and stone, they can also travel in space. Once you start noticing beads, ochre, and carved pieces turning up again and again, another pattern slowly comes into focus. Some of these materials are far from home. Obsidian is one of the clearest examples. Volcanic glass, sharp enough to split hair, formed only in particular eruptions in particular places. When archaeologists map obsidian sources and then analyze the chemistry of obsidian blades and flakes at ancient campsites, they can match them like fingerprints. Again and again they find the same thing. Tools sitting hundreds of kilometers from the volcano that made them. It's the same with certain shells. Marine shells, pierced and worn as beads, lying in layers of soil far inland, in deserts and river valleys that have not seen the sea for thousands of years. The species can be identified. Their modern relatives still live on coasts, sometimes hundreds of miles away. Ochre shows similar journeys, a distinctive red or yellow pigment whose mineral signature points to a single hill or deposit, scattered in tiny flecks, at sites spread out across an entire region. Exotic stones tell the same quiet story. A particular kind of green or black or striped rock that only occurs in one mountain range, turned into axes or pendants, then found far beyond the shadow of those mountains. You can imagine one explanation: a few adventurous individuals making long, lonely treks to distant cliffs and shores, coming home with packs full of raw material. And no doubt that happens sometimes. But when the same obsidian source shows up in dozens of sites arranged like stepping stones across a landscape, or the same shell species appears in layers spanning centuries, a different picture becomes more likely. Not heroic solo journeys, but a chain, a web. Anthropologists call one version of this down-the-line exchange. Instead of one group walking 500 miles to a volcano, they trade with neighbors 50 miles away, who trade with their neighbors, and so on. A core of obsidian might pass through 8 or 10 different camps before finally becoming a knife far from its origin. The material moves in small jumps, but over time it covers enormous distances. How do archaeologists tell? Partly by the way the material thins out. Near the source, obsidian or shells are abundant and used casually, lots of waste flakes, big pieces, even broken chunks tossed aside. Further away, the same material becomes rarer, more carefully used, appearing as tiny blades or small curated objects. The frequency and size shrink with distance, like ripples fading out from a stone tossed into a pond. They also look at patterns in style. If a particular kind of bead or tool shape gradually shifts as it moves away from its source, each region adding its own twist, that suggests a chain of communities copying and modifying an idea as it passes along, rather than one central exporter delivering finished goods everywhere. Behind all this movement, there is another quiet fact. Exchange is almost never just about objects. In small-scale societies that anthropologists have studied in more recent times, gifting and trading are ways of making people, not just moving things. A necklace given is a tie created. An obsidian blade passed on might be a bride gift, a thank you for shared hunting, a peace offering after a quarrel, a symbol of an alliance. Marriage itself can be a form of exchange. When a young woman goes to live with her partner's group, she doesn't travel alone. She carries language, stories, songs, taboos, healing recipes, planting tricks, and the styles of beads and ornaments she grew up with. She might also carry literal goods, shells from her river, pigment from her hills, obsidian from a quarry her kin control. In return, her relatives receive gifts, meat, hides, tools, ornaments. More importantly, they gain a partner band, a place where a hungry child might be sent in a bad season, where news will travel quickly, where help can be asked without shame. Over time, these strands of marriage, gift and memory weave into networks that can stretch for hundreds of miles. They thicken at certain points. Seasonal aggregation sites are some of those nodes, places where, at a particular time of year, scattered bands come together. A river crossing where animals migrate, a lake whose fish swell in number during the dry season, a sheltered valley that offers predictable grazing. At these spots, the population density briefly spikes. Fires dot the ground. Old friends see each other again. Strangers meet for the first time. There is courtship, storytelling, argument, reconciliation, shared rituals perhaps, that only happen when the whole extended network is present. And there is exchange. Bundles of hides are opened. A person from the coast lays out strings of shell beads and dried fish. Someone from the upland forests offers resin, medicinal plants, feathered ornaments. Someone from the volcanic plateau shows off glossy obsidian points that cut like nothing else. Things change hands, but so do ideas. A new way of hafting a spear. A different melody for an old song. A clever trap design. A pattern of scars or paint associated with a particular rite of passage. When groups part again and scatter back across the landscape, they don't just carry heavier packs. They carry news, who has died, who was born, where the herds were thick last year, where sickness has appeared, which groups have been quarrelsome, which generous. In an environment without grain stores, without banks, without written contracts, this kind of network is a safety net. If your local hunt fails, you know which distant kin you can visit. When a drought hits your valley, the memory of past gatherings tells you which river valley is more likely to have water, which group once shared food with you and might do it again. Food doesn't have to be stored only in baskets or bellies. It can be stored in relationships. Innovation moves along these same paths. A new kind of barbed point invented in one corner of a continent can spread over 1,000 miles within a few thousand years, faster than genes, but slower than gossip. A certain pigment recipe, giving a deeper or more durable red, can quietly colonize bodies and caves far from where it arose. None of this requires markets in the modern sense. There is no universal currency, no posted prices, no centralized authority enforcing contracts. Obligation is written in memory, not on clay tablets. And yet, something recognizably economic is happening. The circulation of scarce resources, the balancing of risk, the strategic creation of ties. Identity shows up again, threaded through it all. The materials you bring to a gathering say something about where you come from. A certain shade of ochre is from the people beyond the ridge. A specific shell species marks those whose relatives live near a particular coast. A distinctive way of shaping a point or arranging beads may function almost like a regional dialect, instantly legible to those who know, invisible as a code to outsiders. Objects become social signatures, they say. This is who we are connected to. This is the path we walk. These are the stories that lead to us. When archaeologists map these signatures across time and space, they see skeins of connection, clusters of sites sharing styles, chains of exotic materials fading with distance, sudden appearances of new forms that hint at contacts long ago. Long before coins clinked in marketplaces or merchants kept accounts on papyrus, human lives were already entangled in a wide, shifting web of exchange. Not a global economy, but a continental nervous system, carrying materials, memories, and meanings from campfire to campfire, year after year, generation after generation. Those gatherings, those exchanges of meat and obsidian and songs, hint at something else too. If people are moving materials and stories across hundreds of miles, they are probably also moving meanings. Ideas about what is dangerous, what is powerful, what is forbidden, what is sacred. We don't have their prayers. We don't know the names they whispered into the dark. But we do have their dead. Burials are one of the clearest windows we get into the inner worlds of Ice Age people. The body itself is a canvas where meaning is written, even when nothing else survives. Sometimes bodies are left in simple pits. No grave goods, no obvious offerings, just careful placement. The care itself matters. Someone dug, someone carried, someone chose a spot and laid the body there. In other places, the graves are anything but simple. There are skeletons dusted thickly with red ochre, as if bathed in colour. There are children buried with beads counting in the thousands, each one shaped and drilled by hand. There are adults laid to rest with tools, animal teeth, ornaments, sometimes antlers framing the head like a crown. Each of these choices is silent speech. You don't give a child a necklace of hundreds of painstakingly worked shells if it means nothing. You don't scatter precious pigment over a body unless colour itself has a role to play in the story of death. What were they thinking? We can offer possibilities, not certainties. Maybe ochre stood for blood or rebirth, or the earth itself embracing the body. Maybe tools and ornaments were gifts for a journey elsewhere, or marks of who the person had been. Maybe beads counted kin, or seasons or achievements. Across many hunter-gatherer societies known from recent history, death brings danger and obligation at once. The dead must be honoured, appeased, remembered. Their presence lingers in places and objects. Forgetting them feels risky. If anything like that was true in the deep past, then burials were not just private grief. They were ritual acts. Moments when the group came together around a body and for a while moved in a shared pattern. Digging, arranging, sprinkling, singing, speaking, rehearsing a story about what happens when a human life ends. Ritual need not be grand to be powerful. Think of a small band choosing where to bury someone. The selection of the place is already a kind of map of meaning. A certain slope becomes where our people lie. A bend in the river becomes the edge between the living and the dead. Over time, that place gathers memory. People avoid shouting there. Children are told not to play too roughly. When the band returns in later seasons, someone might pour a little water on the ground, or leave a scrap of food, or speak a name. No temple stones rise. No priestly class appears, but a sacred geography slowly thickens. You can see hints of this in the way certain landscapes are used again and again. Caves are one obvious example. They are shelter, yes, but also more than that. Some caves contain layers of occupation and art, hearths and burials, as if multiple generations kept returning to the same dark, echoing spaces. For people whose days are spent under open sky, a deep cave would be another world. Cold, still, quiet. A place where your own breathing sounds loud, where firelight catches stone and shadow in strange shapes. It does not take much imagination to see how such places could become special. Maybe certain caves were only entered at particular times of year. Maybe only some people went in, the skilled storytellers, the healers, the ones who could handle fear. Mountains, too, would stand out on any horizon. High, difficult, often capped with snow or shrouded in cloud. A place where weather changes quickly, where thunder rolls. Many later cultures treat mountains as the homes of gods or spirits. It is at least plausible that Ice Age people also saw them as the dwelling places of powerful forces. Water sources would have their own weight, springs that never ran dry, even in bad years. Lakes that seemed to rise and fall with the seasons. Rivers whose floods both destroyed and renewed. If your survival depends on water you cannot control, it is easy to feel that rivers have moods, that springs can be offended or appeased. Animals, too, push their way into the sacred. Think of reindeer or bison, mammoth or horse, appearing year after year along the same migration routes, their numbers the difference between hunger and plenty. A successful hunt might feel like more than skill, it might feel like a gift. A failed hunt might feel like a rebuke. Some animals are dangerous in other ways. Big cats, bears, wolves, predators seen rarely, half glimpsed at the edge of firelight or heard howling in the night. They would be obvious candidates for stories about spirits, guardians, enemies, or teachers. When you see a cave wall covered with overlapping outlines of animals, painted and engraved over centuries, it is tempting to think of shrines. Places where people came not just to depict what they saw, but to negotiate with it, to call animals into existence, to thank them or ask their return. We should be careful here. The idea of shamans leading trance dances in painted caves is attractive, but the evidence is thin. We can't interview the artists. We don't know the songs that went with the images. What we can say is this: humans have bodies and nervous systems like ours today, and those bodies are responsive to certain practices in very predictable ways. If a group dances in unison around a fire for hours, moving to a steady rhythm, their breathing and heart rates sync, their sense of individual boundaries softens. They may feel as if they are part of one larger thing. If a particular person fasts or isolates themselves or stays awake through a long night of chanting and drumming, they are likely to experience visions, patterns, lights, the sense of a presence, voices speaking in the quiet of their own minds. If you add psychoactive plants or fermented drinks where available, the intensity increases. None of this requires modern neuroscience to understand in practice. People everywhere have discovered these technologies of experience again and again: dance, deprivation, repetition, storytelling, music. They are cheap, reliable ways to shift consciousness. Whether or not we call the specialists who manage these experiences shamans, some individuals would have been better at it. The ones who could stay up all night and still speak clearly. The ones whose dreams seemed to predict the weather or the hunt. The ones who knew which plant eased pain, which bark brought visions, which song calmed a frightened child. In small bands, such people might not have been separate castes. A good hunter could also be a good visionary. A skilled midwife might also be a keeper of certain stories and rituals. Authority would have been woven from multiple strands: age, competence, charisma, and a reputation for walking safely along the edge between ordinary and extraordinary experience. Ritual, whatever form it took, did more than address invisible forces. It also did quiet social work. When a group gathers to bury someone, they are not only sending off a soul, they are coordinating the living. Grief is shared. Conflicts are set aside, at least for a while. Older members might tell the story of how the dead person once saved a hunt, or survived a harsh winter, or broke a taboo and what followed. In that telling, rules are reinforced without anyone having to preach. Children listen. They learn what their people admire and what they fear. They hear which actions brought luck, which brought misfortune. Norms sink in, wrapped in memory and emotion. The same is true for initiation rites. We don't have direct evidence for specific ceremonies, but many foraging societies mark the transition from child to adult with ordeals, long runs, scarification, isolation, teaching of secret songs or names. These rites create a shared sense of us that can stretch beyond immediate family, shared fear, shared relief, shared secrecy. These are powerful glues. Seasonal gatherings would be natural times for such rituals. When multiple bands assemble, marriages are arranged, disputes arbitrated, alliances reaffirmed. Having structured ceremonies, dances everyone knows, formulas of greeting and parting, oaths spoken in unison, reduces the chances that a small misunderstanding will flare into violence. Ritual is a way of making expectations visible. You bring an offering because that is what everyone does. You stand in a certain place because that is where your age set stands. You accept gifts in a specific order because that's how you show respect. Even if no one can fully explain why, the pattern itself smooths interactions. There is no reason to think all groups did this in the same way. Spiritual life in Ice Age and early Holocene worlds was almost certainly as variable as languages and tool styles. One valley's people might give great importance to ancestral bones, keeping them in caves and handling them in rites. Their neighbours might cremate the dead and scatter ashes in rivers. Some might focus on large animals in their art and stories. Others might emphasize plants or small game or stars. Climate, resources, and history would all leave their mark. A group living near a dangerous river might develop rich water rituals. Another, dwelling beside a particularly striking mountain, might build its myths around that peak. A people who survived a devastating disease could develop taboos about certain foods or contacts that, over time, become sacred lore. Archaeology only catches fragments of this diversity. A cluster of graves here, an arrangement of stones there, pigments in a cave, a carved figurine buried far from any habitation site. From those fragments we can infer two things at once. First, that humans long before cities were already investing enormous effort in rituals around death, place, and memory. They were not just surviving from day to day, they were weaving their lives into stories that reached beyond a single lifespan. Second, that there was no single, simple Stone Age religion. There were countless local traditions, some perhaps lasting for thousands of years, others flickering briefly and vanishing without a trace. What they shared, most likely, was less a specific creed than a structure, the use of patterned action and heightened experience to make sense of uncertainty, to bind groups together, to teach the young what matters. Long before anyone carved a temple column or wrote a sacred text, human beings were already kneeling by graves, painting in darkness, dancing under stars, feeling that some moments and some places were set apart from the ordinary flow of time. Those feelings and the rituals that grew around them would shape how people related to animals, to landscapes, to each other, and eventually to the new way of living that was slowly approaching on the horizon. A way of life where food came from fields, not from wandering herds. As the Ice Age drew toward its later chapters, those rituals and sacred landscapes were unfolding against a world that was quietly changing under people's feet. Not in some smooth, gentle way. The climate lurched and stuttered. Glaciers advanced and retreated. Coastlines moved miles in a lifetime as sea levels rose and fell. A valley that had been open grassland for generations might thicken into forest. A rich wetland could dry into scrub. For hunters who had long focused on particular big animals, reindeer, bison, wild horses, seals, this shifting backdrop posed a problem. What happens when the herds that have anchored your world simply do not come back one spring? Or start passing farther away? Or arrive thinner and fewer, year after year? In some places, people doubled down on specialization. They followed the herds more closely, ranged farther, refined hunting techniques, until they could squeeze every possible advantage from a few key species. But in other regions, something different began to appear in the archaeological record. Along coasts, in river valleys, around lakes and marshes, we start to see signs of what anthropologists sometimes call a broad-spectrum strategy, a move away from reliance on a small set of large prey toward using almost everything the landscape could offer. Fish bones pile up in certain sites, representing multiple species and sizes. Shell middens, great heaps of discarded shells, grow over centuries along shorelines. Burned bird bones, trapped hares and rodents, turtles, tortoises, frogs, even insects show up more frequently in the layers. On their own, each of these things is a small meal. Together they are a different way of living. Fishing, for example, is not just another kind of hunting. Once people learn when fish run, how they school, where they rest, the river or coastline becomes a kind of calendar. You can predict pulses of abundance. Nets, weirs, traps, harpoons, hooks, all of these shift the daily rhythm of work. Shellfish collecting goes further. Clams, mussels, oysters, limpets, they do not sprint away or vanish into the forest at the first scent of humans. The tides and seasons make them more or less accessible, but within those patterns they are relatively dependable. You can walk to a familiar rock shelf in the right season and fill a basket. That predictability matters. It means you can stay put longer. You can count on at least a baseline of calories even when hunting is poor. The same is true of many small game animals when taken systematically. Rabbits in burrows, waterfowl at resting lagoons, rodents that thrive in disturbed ground near camps, all can be caught with snares and traps that keep working while people sleep or do other tasks. These are not glamorous foods in later cultural memory. When people think of the Ice Age, they picture mammoth hunts, not mussel picking. But from the perspective of settlement, shellfish and small game are quietly revolutionary. If your group can meet much of its daily need within walking distance of a reliable shoreline, marsh or river, you do not have to track herds across vast distances. Camps shift from being brief stopping points to semi-permanent bases. Hearths reappear in the same places year after year. Trash accumulates, paths wear into the ground. Alongside this widening palette of animal foods, another transformation unfolds, the intensified use of plants. Plants had always been part of human diets, but in the late Ice Age and early Holocene, we start to see tools that only really make sense if people are gathering, processing, and perhaps planning around plant foods in a more deliberate way. Heavy grinding stones show up, lower stones hollowed by years of pounding and rubbing, upper stones smoothed where they were held. These tools are perfect for crushing seeds, nuts, roots, and grains into flours and pastes. Microscopic wear on their surfaces sometimes preserves traces of starch granules from wild grasses, acorns, or legumes. Roasting pits, shallow basins lined with stones, filled with plant material, then covered and baked, become more common. Such pits can turn tough roots into edible food, leach toxins from some nuts, or par-cook bulky plants so they last longer and are easier to transport. There are hints, too, of early storage. Clay-lined hollows that could have held dried seeds or roasted tubers. Pits dug into cooler subsoil, perhaps capped with stones or hides. Even the simple act of caching, leaving bundles of dried fish or nuts in a known place, marked in memory or with a sign, begins to tether people to particular spots on the landscape. None of this is farming. The plants are still wild. The animals still breed themselves, but the relationship is different. Instead of moving endlessly in search of whatever the day offers, some groups begin to plan around the predictable pulses of specific places: the salmon run season, the acorn fall, the ripening of certain grasses, the migrations of waterfowl. The landscape becomes not just backdrop, but schedule. Why did this intensification happen? There are two broad ways researchers tend to think about it, and both may be partly right. One is the pressure story. As climates shifted and some big game populations declined or moved unpredictably, and as human numbers crept upward, people in some areas may simply have had less large prey per person. To avoid hunger, they were pushed to work harder at resources they might previously have ignored: smaller animals, tougher plants, more time-consuming foods. The other is the opportunity story. In some regions, post-glacial environments produced incredibly rich edge zones, estuaries, river deltas, wetlands, oak woodlands, where a diversity of foods was both abundant and clumped. People who experimented with new techniques there might have discovered that broadening their diet allowed denser populations, more secure lives, and the freedom to stay in favoured locations longer. The reality was likely a patchwork. In some valleys, people were cornered into diversifying. In others, they were drawn toward it by generous landscapes that rewarded ingenuity. What ties these possibilities together is flexibility. Groups able to read subtle changes in ice, rainfall, plant flowering, fish behavior, insect swarms, groups willing to try new foods, invent new tools, and shift their seasonal movements would have had a better chance of riding out the wild swings of late Ice Age climate. A band that can survive on reindeer when reindeer are many, on fish when rivers boil with spawning runs, on nuts and roots when hunting is poor, is less likely to be shattered by a single bad year or a failed migration. This broad-spectrum approach also does something else, almost accidentally. Once you're investing time in learning where certain plants grow best, in processing their seeds more efficiently, in storing surpluses for lean times, you're only a few conceptual steps away from noticing that disturbed soil near camp has thicker stands of useful grasses, or that seeds dropped near a hearth sprout more densely next season. You might start favouring certain patches, clearing competing plants, trampling or burning areas in ways that encourage the species you like. None of this has to be conscious agriculture as we would recognise it. It can be a gradual drift, tending without yet fully domesticating. The broad spectrum shift, then, is less a straight road to farming than a widening of the path. It turns people into careful students of whole ecologies: water, soil, plant, animal, season, fire. It anchors them more tightly to particular places, without fully rooting them. It fills their year with more varied tasks: building traps, mending nets, grinding seeds, managing fires, checking caches. And in doing so, it lays down the mental and practical groundwork for later revolutions without making those revolutions inevitable. Many groups around the world developed rich, intensive, broad-spectrum economies and never took the final step into domesticating plants or animals. They had found a balance that worked for others in certain times and places. That balance would eventually tip. The line between tending and planting, between encouraging and controlling, would blur. Fields would appear where wild stands had once grown. Herds would begin to follow human needs rather than their own. But that tipping point belongs to another part of the story. For now, in the late Ice Age world, we can imagine people standing on riverbanks heavy with fish, combing shell-rich shores, roasting roots in deep pits, grinding wild grains on heavy stones. Still hunters, still gatherers, but now also quiet managers of flexible ecologies, learning the subtle arts of making a landscape feed them, year after changing year. If you follow those people along their broad-spectrum path for a few more thousand years, something else begins to happen. The landscape is no longer just a circuit of seasonal stops. Certain places start to feel heavier, more layered, more lived in. A bend in a river that always has good fishing. A terrace above a floodplain with deep, workable soil. A patch of coast where shellfish remain reliable year after year. A spring that never quite runs dry. When a location can feed you for much of the year and maybe support a surplus in good seasons, the logic of constant movement weakens. Why drag elderly relatives, sleeping children, heavy grinding stones, and precious stored food across mountains if you don't have to? You can still move for part of the year. You can still send hunting parties or foraging groups outward. But the camp itself starts to stay. Archaeologists talk about semi-sedentism for this kind of life. Not fully settled in the later village sense, but rooted enough that structures are rebuilt on the same footprint. Hearths reused, trash layers thickened. The ground underfoot remembers you. In some places, this shift is tightly tied to storage. If you can dry fish on racks, smoke meat, roast and grind nuts or grains, you can bank energy against bad seasons. But storage has its own physics. Stones for grinding, pits for keeping, racks for drying. They're heavy, they take effort to build, and they work best when you know you'll be back. A portable life favours light shelters and minimal accumulation. A semi-sedentary life invites investment. We see that in the first real architectural experiments. Along the eastern Mediterranean, for example, Long before fully domesticated wheat and barley appear, people we label as Natufians are already building substantial houses, stone foundations, semi-subterranean floors, arranged in clusters. They return to the same hillsides generation after generation. They lay out pathways between dwellings. They have designated dump areas. Some places even show what look like communal buildings, slightly larger structures where groups might have gathered. In North China, early Holocene groups around rivers and loess plateaus begin digging semi-sunken houses, dugouts with walls and roofs that are repeatedly repaired in the same spots. In New Guinea highlands, long before full-scale agriculture, there are drainage ditches and managed patches where useful plants are encouraged. In parts of the Americas, especially along rich coasts and major rivers, we find shell middens and earthworks so extensive they speak of people returning to the same locations for many generations. These are not neatly fenced villages with streets and fields, but they are more than scattered camps. They are repeated-use sites, places that accumulate not just debris but social meaning. Births, deaths, arguments, love affairs, alliances, ceremonies, all in the same clearings, the same houses, the same communal spaces. Over time, that repetition can turn space into place and place into home. Within this anchored life, the relationship with plants and animals starts to change again. Domestication is sometimes imagined as a sudden invention. Someone plants a seed intentionally and, overnight in historical terms, agriculture appears. The evidence points to a messier, slower, more entangled story. Start with plants. If you're intensively gathering wild grains, legumes or nuts in the same valley every year, you are constantly making small choices. Which stands you harvest first, which plants you leave, which seeds fall where. You may burn off underbrush to make collecting easier. You may trample ground around camp. You may accidentally or deliberately drop seed heads in disturbed soil near your shelters. Over hundreds of years, these tiny preferences can have evolutionary consequences. Plants with slightly tougher seed heads or seeds that hold on longer are more likely to be harvested and moved. Plants whose seeds germinate well in trampled, nutrient-rich soils near camp do better than those that insist on undisturbed meadows. Gradually, the genetic makeup of those plant populations shifts. They become, in a literal sense, co-evolving with human habits. Something similar can happen with animals. The line between wild and domestic isn't a cliff, it's a slope. People might start by regularly driving herds of wild gazelles or deer into natural enclosures, or favouring certain salmon runs or tolerating bold, less fearful boar near camp, because they are easier to hunt. Individuals that are slightly less skittish or that thrive around human disturbance have a small edge. They survive in greater numbers, leaving more offspring that share those traits. Dogs likely begin this way, wolves hovering at the edge of human camps, feeding on scraps, gradually becoming partners instead of rivals. In different parts of the world, these co-evolutionary relationships unfold along different timelines and with different species. In the Levant, wild cereals are tended and harvested intensively before their full domestication. Sickles and grinding stones appear in settlements that are already semi-permanent. In China, millets and later rice follow their own slow arcs, intertwined with riverine and wetland ecologies. In the New Guinea highlands, taro, yams and bananas seem to have been managed and reshaped within a patchwork of gardens, forest and swamp. In the Americas, squash, maize, beans and many other plants each have regional stories, some beginning in small garden plots next to long-used camps, others tied to floodplain fields and shifting forest clearings. There is no single origin point, no lone invention of farming. Instead, many local experiments, many gradual entanglements between human routines and the life cycles of particular species. As populations cluster and settle more firmly, Another quiet transformation begins. The social fabric changes. A fully mobile band, moving often, can only accumulate so much. Wealth is hard to store when everything must be carried or catched. Leadership tends to be personal and situational, based on skill, persuasion, ritual knowledge, rather than anchored in control of land or granaries. Semi-sedentary life starts to bend those rules. If some households have better access to storage pits, or control the best fishing spots, or own more durable tools and ornaments that can be passed on, differences in status can deepen. If certain families claim ancestral rights to specific house plots, terraces or groves, authority can be linked to place. Do we see inequality before agriculture? In some regions, probably yes, but in patchy, debated forms. Burials in some late hunter-gatherer and early semi-sedentary sites show individuals buried with far more goods than others, pendants, tools, ornaments made from exotic materials brought from far away. In a few cemeteries, such wealth seems to run in particular lineages, generation after generation, hinting at hereditary prestige. Elsewhere, the evidence suggests more fluid arrangements. Differences in grave goods or house size may reflect life stage, achievement or ritual role more than rigid class. Some semi-sedentary communities show remarkable signs of sharing communal storage, large public structures, widely distributed imported materials. The point is not that hierarchy automatically follows the first permanent house, or that every anchored community slides toward kings. Some do not. Much depends on environment, population density, neighbours, and cultural choices about how power is justified and limited. What we can say is that semi-sedentism and proto-villages create the conditions under which stronger inequalities become possible. When land can be defended, when surplus can be stored, when ancestral claims can be tied to particular stones and doorways, humans can begin to argue not just about today's hunt, but about who owns tomorrow. This brings us to the word that usually marks the end of the missing years: civilization. Cities, writing, states, taxes, armies, these come much later, in only some parts of the world. But the threshold they stand on was crossed many times, in many ways, long before the first brick was laid at a city wall. In some valleys that threshold looked like a cluster of stone, founded houses around a shared courtyard, wild cereals thick around the edges. In others it was a ring of plank houses on a salmon river, with massive storage pits and ritual posts. In yet others a patchwork of gardens and forest, drainage ditches and raised mounds, anchored by long memories of who cleared which field first. Civilization, seen from this longer perspective, is not a single switch flipped once in Mesopotamia or the Nile. It is a series of local decisions to stay a bit longer, invest a bit more, shape the lives of plants and animals a bit further, and then to build stories, rules, and identities around those decisions. Different places crossed that edge at different times, in different directions, or chose not to cross it at all. But all of them grew from the same deep soil, thousands upon thousands of years when humans learned how to read landscapes, remember seasons, share knowledge, and slowly, cautiously, turn certain spots on the earth into something new. Home. If you zoom out now and let all these stories blur together, the tiny bands in the bottleneck, the Ice Age hunters, the coastal foragers, the first semi-sedentary gardeners, one thing becomes hard to miss. The missing years aren't empty at all. They are full of experiments. Not just in tools or food, but in ways of being human. Over these long, slow millennia, people learned to survive almost everywhere the planet would allow, in deserts and rainforests, on glaciers and beaches, in swamps and open plains. They learned to move when they had to and stay when it made sense, to build fires that warmed without burning everything down, to shape stone and bone and wood into quiet revolutions, to wrap their bodies in fibre and hide, to build walls against wind, to carve out pockets of comfort inside hostile climates. They learned to weave meaning through all of it. The same hands that knapped blades also carved beads. The same voices that planned the hunt also told stories about spirits and ancestors. The same paths that carried obsidian and shells and ochre across continents carried songs, rituals, and remembered obligations. Mobility and networks, technology and comfort, art and belief, ecology and change, none of these lived in separate boxes. They braided together in daily life. A trading journey might also be a pilgrimage. A new kind of shelter might emerge from a ritual gathering place. A change in climate might be explained through myth, then answered with a change in toolkits, in plant tending, in social rules about who shares what and when. When we look back, our view is always partial. Most of what mattered to those people does not fossilize. Laughter doesn't. Kindness doesn't. Shared jokes around a smoky fire, the exact tone of a lullaby, the look passed between two people who have decided to risk a journey together, none of that survives in bone or pollen or stone. Even the things we do find, charred seeds, post holes, pigments, burials, are scattered and incomplete. There are gaps we cannot honestly fill. For many questions we can only offer possibilities, not certainties. But the patterns that do emerge are consistent. Humans, long before cities, were already problem solvers and meaning makers. Already capable of long-distance friendship and careful observation. Already shaping landscapes while being shaped by them in return. If you listen closely, there is a thread of continuity that runs from those first bottleneck survivors through the foragers and fishers and early gardeners all the way to you, lying wherever you are now, letting this story drift past as you fall asleep. You still live in networks you can't see. You still depend on tools you didn't invent, stories you didn't write, plants and animals that have been co-evolving with human hands for thousands of years. You still navigate change, social, climatic, technological, by leaning on others, by sharing information, by imagining futures that don't yet exist. The faces, clothes, and languages have changed. The nervous systems, the need for warmth and safety and belonging have not. So as you rest, you can picture that long human night before civilization, not as a void, but as a slow dawn. People moving under unfamiliar stars, learning how to be together, how to make enough, how to remember. Their choices, their inventions, their mistakes, and their small acts of care, all stacking up quietly over tens of thousands of years, until something like cities becomes possible at all. You are part of that same story, another temporary traveller in a very old experiment. If this journey through deep time has kept you company tonight, you can help it reach other sleepy travellers. Gently tap like, if you'd like more slow history in your evenings. Subscribe if you want to wander further into the past with future episodes. And when you have a moment, tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there as this finds you. Then, if your eyes are heavy, let them close. The fires are banked. The camp is quiet. The long experiment of being human goes on, and for now you can simply rest inside it.